My name is Melissa Gerstein. I am the Gallery Program Coordinator at the Bard Graduate Center, and it is so nice to see such a wonderful crowd for such a great program this evening. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, The Art of Corsetry and Binding with Camilla Huey, in conjunction with our exhibition, Fashioning the Body, The Intimate History of the Silhouette. Fashioning the Body examines the extraordinary ways in which women and men have shaped their bodies into distinctive silhouettes in the name of fashion. The exhibition garnered high acclaim at the Musée des Décoratifs in Paris in 2013 and presents the many devices and materials that have been used to transform the human body from the 17th century to today, including panniers, corsets, crinolines, bustles, stomach belts, girdles, and push-up brassieres. Please pick up some additional information about our upcoming exhibition-related programs featuring walking tours, sketch nights, conversations, concerts, and film presentations. Camilla Huey has more than 25 years experience in couture design, architecture, theater, and film in New York City. Camilla began her career in New York as a textile designer, hand-painting textiles and designing embellishments for couture gowns. From her very first week in New York, she worked with the boldface names of society and the entertainment worlds. Her varied career path included Town and Country magazine, conducting the survey for the redesign of the Guggenheim Museum, to the design and execution of theatrical sets, props, and costumes for Broadway, opera, film, dance, and theater. Camilla founded her own company in Atelier in New York's garment district called the House of Execution. A lifelong devotee of history, Camilla and her husband, Kurt Tomitz, is that correct? Good enough? Okay. Became captivated in 2004 with the Jumel Mansion and its longest resident, Madame Eliza Jumel, in a very unique lady, from what Camilla says. Towards the goal of writing a biography of the lady, they began reading all written material about Madame Jumel and then her circle. After several years of research, the most immediate expression would be to personify these women through material culture and ephemera. This network came to be represented by 9 women surrounding Aaron Burr. The resulting exhibition is called The Loves of Aaron Burr, Portraits in Corsetry and Binding. She is thrilled to examine the connections between her exhibit and that of Fashioning the Body, an intimate history of silhouette. If you haven't had a chance already, after the program, please go to the room behind me called the Seminar Room, and Camilla's works are on display, and they're just exquisite. Beginning in mid-May, Camilla, in cooperation with the New York City Historic House Trust, will embark on an exploration of the Dyckman farmhouse, examining the New York Dutch colonial concept of realism, using their archives, ephemera, and material culture. And I'm sure she has a lot of other projects in the works beyond that. It is my great pleasure to introduce Camilla, and we're going to be watching just a brief clip before she comes up. Have a great evening.
But these women are modern. They wrote expressively. They were among some of the most literate ladies of the Revolutionary era. Artist Camilla Huey has created each of their corsets as a body from which to reanimate their voices. I began to discover a network of women. They were writing sometimes to one another, often about one another or about events that touched their lives. It's often told through weird news, first-hand accounts, sometimes questionable accounts, but when you put all of these together, you come out of it with a germ of truth that isn't found in the history books. This is what reading between the lines is about. You have to realize that when someone comes to sculptural forms such as a corset, they bring their preconceived ideas of what corsets are, of bodice ripping, of the feminine as weak, and all of that is an ideal of feminine. These women weren't weak. These women were tougher than you and I. They were enduring incredible experiences, and I wanted to exhibit that. You had the crux de bear as a woman, whether you were a woman of status or a poor woman, you were still disabled. And it was an amazing journey to read all of their letters and how they lived their lives. And with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution, the birthing of new nations, it was an extremely volatile time, and it allowed women in particular to step outside of prescribed roles, and you truly see these personalities standing forward in the history that hasn't been told.
So my journey began at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. It was a unique piece. It's like a beautiful piece of sculpture. It stands apart from the rest of the city. It's an unknown jewel. And I started investigating the people who lived there, and one of them, the longest resident of the Jumel Mansion, was Madame Jumel. She lived there for over 90 years. And she was this unique woman who had been born in a brothel, had made her way to New York, lived as a prostitute, was on the stage, but married a respectable man and died the wealthiest woman in New York, and garnered great respect. So she was fascinating, and I began to find, trying to see her clearly as a person, I began investigating a circle of women around her, and I found that they were all writing not just about her, but they were writing about themselves and one another, and it became sort of a social network that I was investigating, all in the 18th and 19th century. And my background is not as a writer, it's as a couturier, and I thought the best way to personify and exemplify would be in my own métier, which is couture. And so I began designing corsets and dresses for these women.
Eliza Jumel was a woman who used consumerism and display as a method of stating her status. She was born poor in a brothel and died the wealthiest woman in America. She was smart, shrewd, she was always outside of society. Madame Jumel was the wife of one of the most wealthy merchants in the world. I began following their business. They write about furniture, fabrics, colors, laces. All of the things that I'm involved in are the materials that he's trading in. It was with a great deal of knowledge that I got to it, reading these lists of cargo. I went and visited her dress at the Museum of the City of New York. I measured and recreated a boned bodice. She's wearing two corsets. The first is from the era when Madame Jumel would have been 10, dirty and aged and distressed, and showing her lowly status at that point, where she was selling herbs in the streets of Providence, Rhode Island. The front of the corset is stuffed with dried flowers and herbs that she would have collected in the countryside and brought into town to sell. The corset over that is a red velvet corset from a later period when she was herself walking the streets of Providence. She leaves Providence in the 1790s after giving birth to an illegitimate child. She returns 3 years later. We don't know what happened to her during that time, but she's reading and writing English and French and literate. Within the boned bodice and corsets of Madame Jumel's personification, there are small fork and spoon sewn to the inside of the bodice, and this is the manners that she will achieve and put on. She's dressing herself up because she had no position. She had to imagine herself as a grand lady. I have her atop a stack of books that represent a small library of Stephen Jumel's that creates the foundation for her personification, which is also what his position is in her life. He was a man of means. She lived with him as his mistress and housekeeper. He is tricked into marrying her in a deathbed scene worthy of a Harlequin romance. She has a priest and a doctor at bedside. He says, "Oh, my dear, what can I do for you?" thinking that she's going to die. She says, "Just make an honest woman of me." He marries her, and the next morning, she springs out of bed and goes driving in her carriage. With his signed approval, she gained power of attorney over all of his estates and had herself named femme sole while her husband was living. Comes back to America, takes possession of all of his real estate in New York and upstate New York, amasses an enormous fortune. She made far more of his fortune than he would have. This woman didn't shirk from making a display of herself. Where other women were quiet and polite, she would step forward. She broke all the rules. It's what makes her a modern woman.
So she was quite a gal, and that's where it started. And I wanted to know, I started at the New York Historical Society in the Jumel papers, and they are largely receipt books. And that's what I was talking about there, is that I was going through these lists, and Stephen Jumel had 300 different ways to describe white taffeta. And I was fascinated. This is a world that I've been working in for 25 years here in New York, and interested in before that. And he was having ribbons made in Lille, and they were sending furniture back and forth across the Atlantic. They were crossing many times. In 1815, he had over 360 voyages crossing the Atlantic and making this circuitous route through the Caribbean and going to Bordeaux. And it was tantalizing reading, and you could see when something in the account books was personal and when something was crockery and pottery and goods, and he was buying all sorts of things. His fame was founded on his importation of French wines and cognacs, a lot of brandy. He didn't deal so much in Madeira. That was he was from Bordeaux, and he brought Bordeaux grapes, and off the acclivity of the Jumel Mansion, he had white Bordeaux grapes planted on that bluff that goes down to the polo houses now, and there's still wild vines lost in there that people see. Occasionally you catch a sight of something. So it's a fascinating world, and it didn't stop for me and for my husband. And we were consumed by this all the time. And so with Madame Jumel, her second husband was Aaron Burr. And so I discovered this circle of women, and what they had in common, the nexus, was Aaron Burr. He's an unlikely character. He's rather defamed as a founding father, the fallen founder. But he is a feminist, and he's an abolitionist, and he went to Jefferson when he was vice president and campaigned for there to be an American Indian in the Jefferson cabinet. There was not. None of the other founding fathers really pursue this, and it comes from his mother. This is Esther Burr's corset, and she was a fifth-generation literate woman in this Massachusetts household. Her father is Jonathan Edwards. Her mother is Sarah Pierpont Edwards. And she had this relationship with her friend Sarah Prince, and rather than sending letters, they had journals that would cross paths that they would send back. You would write in the journal for 10 days and then send it to your friend Sarah, and in the meantime hers was coming to you. And Sarah was living in Boston, and Esther had married and moved to Princeton, and so they were friends that were separated by what was at that time a great distance, and this was their way of maintaining their friendship and keeping a closeness. And so what you see under the shroud of lace is mortuary stationery, because Esther Burr was surrounded by death, and she was this incredibly sprightly and bright-humored woman that I thoroughly enjoyed knowing. She was sarcastic. She was a minister's daughter who then became Aaron Burr Sr., a minister's wife. He founded Princeton University. She could not be more worn out by supporting and hosting the clergy in Princeton. It was, they built and designed Nassau Hall. And then this tragedy, she's 26 years old, and first Aaron Burr Sr. dies, then Esther dies, and the Jonathan Edwards is coming to get the two children, Sally and Aaron Burr, and he dies on the way. And then the grandmother, Sarah Pierpont Edwards, is coming to get them, and she dies as well. So it's just all of fevers and chills, and within months, an entire family was gone. And so this is Leonora Sensei, and this was where the idea of the importance of material culture came to me, because I was reading her letters. I was reading The Horrors of Saint-Domingue, A Secret History. And she is a woman who wrote a first-hand account of the Haitian Revolution. There are only 12 accounts in the history of that revolution. And, excuse me.
It's all silent. It's all Leonora Sensei.
Okay. And so in the back of this book by Michael Drexler that contains the secret history, she is, Burr has returned from his exile in Europe and has come back to New York, and he writes her a letter and says, "Come see me." She had been a mistress of his before she married Louis Sensei. And she's like, "No, I really can't come. I'm too busy." And she starts describing her business, and this really touched home with me. She had 7 young women working for her. She told what their ages were, what they did. She had seen a new fad that had come over from Paris, which was the making of silk flowers, that she describes how much better they are for your dress when you're going to a ball, because they don't wilt and they don't discolor the silk of the dress. And so she's making this business, and she just can't come see him now, and perhaps sometime later, but if he were to set up a branch in New York, then she would come and visit. So, stole my heart.
Early in the process of talking with the Jumel Mansion, the director there asked me how would I represent loss, because that's one of the tragedies of Aaron Burr's life, that as such an exceptional intellect, an extraordinary statesman, there's so much of his history that's lost. In December of 1812, Theodosia was put aboard the Patriot to sail to New York to meet Aaron Burr for the first time since his exile in Europe. She's traveling with 2 trunks filled with his papers. It's all of the papers from him being vice president with Thomas Jefferson, from being in the Senate and the House of Representatives in New York State, all of his correspondence, and a 2-volume manuscript telling of his eyewitness account of the founding of this country. She sets sail. They're stopped by a British warship. They are given passage, and that's the last time they're seen. The only thing that washes ashore is what they call the Nag's Head portrait, which is a portrait of Theodosia Burr in a white empire gown. We know that whether she walks the plank or the gale blows up and the ship founders, that she's lost at sea. How to represent the descent of this woman into the water in her gown with the papers floating around her. The papers are not letters, they are signatures of who we know the correspondence to have contained. And the dress is an empire dress with a perfect empire cane-boned corset with the account of her demise written inside the lining. Resin casting loss required a crew. There is a time factor. It was a 10-foot tall by 4-foot wide resin cast piece. And so it was a virtual bucket brigade, people who each had their assignment in the creation of the resin, with myself arranging and pulling things through the resin to cast them in the water. It's prone on the floor, as you would see her were you standing aboard ship looking down at her, just sinking into the water. It's the last gasp.
So part of the process of the research and the gathering of all these materials over, it was years. I was in archives, traveled to France following correspondence, went to New Orleans, down the eastern seaboard, finding, ship's records and hotel bills and various little bits, that each one that gives you a clue. But at a certain point, you're awash in information and matter that you've discovered and hunted for and found, and how to display that and the Jumel has this stairwell that goes up 3 floors, and I wanted to have a representation just of the research and all the documents, the visuals, the pages from journals from all over the world, from libraries and archives, in this well. And I have it suspended from, there's a medallion created in plaster that is the profile of Madame Jumel in pulled plaster. And from that is suspended a cage, a panier, covered in red grosgrain, and that's the framework that's supporting all of the information. So it's under her skirts, and you look into this mirror and you can see up 3 floors through all of the research to her profile.
The vortex is an assemblage of the papers and letters and images that were encountered during all the research. It's a representation of how disparate the sources are. These papers get scattered to the winds, especially in the Jumel case, but it's a swirl and things are coming out of chronological order and from different places all over the globe. You look into a fragmented mirror that shows many images, and you look through the panier. The waist on the panier is the exact measurements that we have from Madame Jumel's dress at the Museum of the City of New York. It is representing these women's lives, their silhouettes, in red grosgrain that is the armature to support all the research.
So I only had, that I knew of when I started this project, was there is one dress that is known for certain to have belonged to Madame Jumel. It's from the 1850s. It's at the Museum of the City of New York. And I had an old photograph of it from the 1940s. And I wanted to, she was described not only as New York's most beautiful woman, but as an Amazon. That she was, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton said that it was breathtaking to see her, that she was so tall, and I wanted to see what size is this woman who's an Amazon, what does that mean? And so I went to measure the dress, and she's my size. So I patterned it, and that's what you see in the other room as a sculpture. But along the way, in researching antique corsets, I discovered in a file in London that there was a corset at the Hermitage that they believed had belonged to Theodosia Burr. And so I went also to the Hermitage and visited that corset. This is a replica that I made at my studio from the pattern. In a drill, I used materials as similar as possible to the actual materials that I saw in the corset. And then I recreated it in it's like a net that you can see through, because I wanted to show the architecture, the actual placement of the bones. And when you splay the corset flat, you began to really see these contours, and seeing them in 3D is one thing, but seeing them flat and as a pattern is what truly fascinates me, is how these flat patterns come together as stays to encapsulate the body.
Theodosia Burr's corset is an exact replica of the corset they think may have been hers at her former home, the Hermitage in Hohokus, New Jersey. I went and measured that corset and patterned it and recreated the corset at my studio, then recreated it again in a brocade that you can see through that is like a net. I wanted to spread the corset flat and see the structure and the architecture of a corset, the way that these patterns are created, that encase the human form is as interesting to me as the final result when it's a piece that's worn.
And so these are, this is my pantheon of panniers. These are panniers that I have made. Prospect 2, there was a goddess, Fortuna, that was a 12-foot span. This is a dress for Zach Posen that was in Vogue magazine. This is Madame Jumel's pannier. And so it's about the form and the sensation of wearing things like that, and how it, for theatrical pieces, we made a film with Prospect 2, and for theatrical pieces like that, or for fashion shows, you know, it's about the scale and the impact of that as a visual for apparel. And so where this comes from is from court dress, and it's about the patterns and how they changed the silhouette, and the corset training that women went through, the experience of their bodies is really incredible. This was Margaret Moncrief's corset coming together. The bones are externally mounted with ribbon, and there are no seams. It's actually an overlapping process. And then the watercolor of the flowers. She was the first love of Aaron Burr and accused of communicating military intelligence through the language of flowers. And so this is Theodosia Burr.
Theodosia Alston is lighter. You feel her volubility as a young woman, the expression of the heart coming forward in her letters to her husband and to Aaron Burr. Theodosia was the first corset that I made, and that form, the angle of it, the movement that it gives you sculpturally, the very small waist expanding into the really large chest area gave me the idea of these books as signatures and the binding of the corset as opposed to a book binding, holding these lives and the secrets that they're telling you that are bursting out of them.
And so what you've seen in the corsets before this were that they came to this very sharp point in the front, and that a very small waist, because you had the cage and the pannier. This is an 1880s corset. It's for Jane McManus, who coined the phrase manifest destiny. She was pro the annexation of Texas and the western lands for the United States, and was accused as the co-respondent in the Burr-Jumel divorce. She was 26, Burr was 77. So it has a full busk down the front, but it has the hips cut out in the side and giving a close shape, but allowing those to be pronounced and accentuated.
A very interesting period in history because you go through so many extremes. You come from the 18th century and court dress. You have this large silhouette of a farthingale that become panier, and that was the look of the French court. Then you will come forward past the French Revolution to the rule of Napoleon, and you have the Marvelous wearing dresses that are of a thin cotton lawn, which is a cotton fabric you can practically see through. They would go so far as to wet the fabric. It's the 19th century version of a wet t-shirt, and there's stories of Josephine Bonaparte and her ladies in waiting doing dances for the generals after dinners thrown at the Tuileries when the Bonapartes were in court. And so this is the revolution happening after modernity has come to the French civilization. There was an empire corset, but it wasn't constricting to the waist. It didn't cut off the breath and confine the woman's movement as much as the 18th and later 19th century corsets. As you move towards the Civil War, it becomes a bell-shaped form that the skirts are over. And so you have this enormous volume reducing visually into this very small waist. And it's an example of a woman's status. It's about her husband's status and the volume of fabric that it takes to create one of these dresses, the fineness of that fabric, the layers that are on, under, and over the crinoline, the number of attendants required for her toilette and vanity in the morning to get dressed increases. And all of this is a symbol of status. Women who were working weren't wearing these enormous cages. They were wearing full, long skirts, and the corsets were not as extreme, but they didn't have all of the trappings that we're seeing here.
And so as we move into late Victorian corsetry, we encounter fetishism. And it becomes more of a choice whether or not to wear a corset, and that's exactly where fetishism can enter, is that it is a choice by the wearer, and most often it's projected onto one by the male counterpart, is what they've found most often in fetishism, is that 99% of fetishists are men. And it becomes an issue of how to sit and how to move in these corsets, because they're getting tighter and tighter, very restrictive. And so this is back to Madame de Pompadour, and the way she's sitting, because that busk comes to a point, is that her legs are spread. The busk is going down below the pelvic bone, and she's pitched forward with her knees apart, her ankles crossed. Civil War era dress. And the trouble with cages. How to get near your love in a cage. How to travel in a stagecoach with all your girlfriends. And then there are always the issues of what it does to the body. Corsets are, of course, the saying goes, always better on a squishy body, is that you can push in and down, the organs move down. The rib cage is malleable. The rib cage can, with corset training, where they reduce the corset an inch a week or an inch a month, you can actually reduce your waist once the corset is off. And it requires the rib cage curving down and closing in towards the spine. And the alimentary tract moves down. And we have our modern Venus from 1786. And here she is today. So we've come full circle. The issues of body and women have only been more broadly realized. And these are some of my ladies, some of my clients. My favorite dress. Thank you very much.
Can I answer any questions? If anybody has any questions, now is the time.
The papers and documents which were in the water, what were they? Were they letters?
They were signatures on letters because we knew who Burr had been communicating with, but we didn't know the contents of those very important documents. It's an entire area of history that's missing, that the answers won't be known. That's why the Western adventures, his treasonable acts, will never be fully investigated and explored, because it was such a great loss. And then all of his papers from being vice president. Yeah. So, yes.
The actress who plays the mother in Downton Abbey, the American, I forget who the actress is.
Elizabeth McGovern.
Thank you so much. Mentioned that when she had to wear corsets as part of her acting job, that it was so constricting that she literally couldn't breathe. And she said in one interview that she said she didn't think there was any accident that women had a greater voice in the 20s once they stopped wearing corsets. And I wonder if you have seen in any of your research a similar kind of thing, the letters you've read or the things you've done, when women stopped wearing corsets in the early part of the 19th century with the empire sort of dress look, when the corsets were maybe there but way less constraining. Did you notice any sort of
Well, they
bump
were.
in feminism or?
Well, there was definitely a bump in feminism at that time, but do you attribute it to a corset or to 3 revolutions going on,
Good point.
end to end? And so we have the American Revolution, where the women were speaking and were not heard and were not acted upon. You have the French Revolution, where the same thing happens. And you have the Haitian Revolution. And so it's a world in revolt at that time, and that's what is so interesting about this period to me, is that there's volatility, and I think women and I think people of lesser status in a society have opportunity when there's chaos, when there's changeability going on. I think that's your time to move. And perhaps we should be looking at that now as women.
You know, people often, this follows up on that question, people often think of corsets as things that constrain, but when I look at the way that you've dealt with them, it seems to me that you're talking because you understand that that fashion is a language of power, and you see these women as powerful, so they're operating with all the elements of their dress as something that empowers them in a way in their lives. And probably Eliza Jumel is the best one, because she leveraged herself through her looks and her fashionability to a position of great power. So I'd be interested in your comment on fashion as a language of power in relationship to your project.
Well, it really is, and that's what began at the early part of this with these women. They were so appealing to me. Like women that I would meet now, they were very vibrant and very alive in their wants and needs, and women who wear corsets, and the letters that I found about them historically talk about, I mean, there are letters that disparage corsetry and the fashions, but the women who like them do talk about how it strengthens and reinforces their backs, and they talk about the physicality of it, and how much they do enjoy, and what the styles are, and they're all about designing them and having stays made for them by their mantua maker. It was a regular part of their lives to be fitted for this. Yes.
I'm a costume designer and an artist, but also a fashion historian, and I find that there is often a gulf between art practice and scholarship or academic research. So I have sort of a two-part question for you, which is, were you approached or commissioned to do this project, or did you come up with it on your own and have to convince people of its value? And did you find any particular both positive feedback or skepticism or criticism because of being at sort of this crossroads between art and scholarship?
The last part of that, being between art and scholarship, is I think sometimes I felt skepticism when I would go into archives and was attempting to do research, just exactly who are you and what are your intentions. It was never voiced to me that way, but I had letters of introduction and made my way into it. So it wasn't really a problem, but I did feel that viewpoint was present. I didn't acknowledge it. But so far as the beginnings of the project, I did this because I needed a way to connect with these women as characters and wanting to write about them and bring their lives to all of you, to everyone else. And so there wasn't anyone underwriting this. I created 2 of the corsets, and a Japanese magazine wrote an article about them. And someone at the Morris-Jumel Mansion saw the article and asked me if I would exhibit them in a group show. And I said that I would, but that they had to be shown as works in progress. And during that exhibition, we began talking, the curators, the director, we all began talking, and they asked me if there was more to this that I could do. And so it was very organic, the way that it grew, and we were all talking about it. It's something that we're interested in, and personifying and bringing these characters forward is in their interest, and it was something that I wanted to do, so it happened very naturally. So I live across the street from the Jumel Mansion, and it was natural that this would happen. So, anything else?
location exactly?
It's at 160th Street.
Oh, so it's here.
It's in Washington Heights, on the border of Washington Heights and Harlem. So it's New York's best kept secret. The whole neighborhood is this jewel box. It's just beautiful. Great stage set. Oh, so the all the clips that you saw are a preview and excerpts from a film that we created because these corsets were exhibited in this mansion, which is celebrating its 250th anniversary this year, and it's Manhattan's oldest residence. And it was very unique that these women, in Madame Jumel's case, she lived there, but most of the women visited or were at the house. They knew about the house. We have letters from Theodosia talking to Aaron Burr about this house, saying that she really thinks that he should trade in Richmond Hill and move to Morris's place. That it's a commanding view and how beautiful it is, and that he will be able to live like a prince when he's there. So they all had a connection to it, and so it was very unique to be able to cite artwork that's historic in the very place where that history took place. And so we wanted, through the film, to document the pieces in situ as they were exhibited at the mansion. And it will premiere next week at the Morris-Jumel Mansion on Thursday, the 14th, at 6 o'clock. Yes.
There's a small house at number 17 Commerce Street in the village that has a plaque on it saying that it's the Aaron Burr house. Do you know how that fits into his story?
I don't. He moved around a great deal. He was actually at the Jumel Mansion for a very brief period of time. And he would often, even when he had Richmond Hill, he would have offices in town, because Richmond Hill was at that point an hour from town. And so I don't know the story on that particular house. No.
What can be done to get more people up to the house? Because it's one of the most important houses in the country. Washington's headquarters, and so many strategic meetings there with founders of the country. From a decorative point of view, some of the most important wallpaper, for example, and furniture in the United States. But the truth is, New Yorkers don't go there. And it's a great tragedy. And the other thing is the gardens, which I gather used to be lavish, are quite thin now. And I'm wondering what can be done for the house, and most importantly, what can get people to visit the house.
Well, that's an ongoing problem. People, when they hear about the Morris-Jumel Mansion, even if it sort of vaguely rings a bell, they think that it's in another borough. They think that it's up past Van Cortlandt or something. And they have a great new director, Carol Ward, who's doing a lot with education and promotion. They have contemporary art there. My exhibition was the first contemporary art of a solo artist that they had there. And this year, Yinka Shonibare, the Nigerian-British artist, just had an opening last Friday, which was wonderful. And much can be done for the Morris-Jumel Mansion, and we should encourage all of our friends to help. I started with historic research of the gardens because it was so compelling to me that there would still be nearly 2 acres of an original site with a house that old in New York City, and I had never seen it or heard of it before I moved there.
What's next for you?
Well, I have several things in the plans. The one that I can talk about is the Dykeman farmhouse, which this is Mary Alice Dykeman Dean. She married Bashford Dean, who was simultaneously the head of the Museum of Natural History and the Met. Both as unpaid positions. He was a bit of a dilettante, but an accomplished dilettante. I was asked by Wave Hill, which is their former home, to create portraits of the two of them. And so this is Mary Alice, and she and her sister Francesca restored that house and gave it to the city of New York. It's on an acre of land at 204th and Broadway. It's the last parcel of original Dykeman farm land. Is the house got actually moved to that position. And so they've opened their archives, and we're going to start on May 20th and begin planning what we can do to illuminate that history. Yes.
So I've noticed in museum exhibitions that corsets are often displayed as decorative objects with invisible mannequins and sort of perfectly matched delicate silk ribbons. But I know as a dresser that corsets, as you say, were really meant to reshape women's bodies, and that is something that's very difficult to showcase in exhibiting corsets. I was wondering if that was a question that you played around with in the exhibition of your artwork.
I didn't deal so much with the reshaping as the shape. And, with the two cases where I had actual garments, I tried to exhibit the real presence of the woman. And I was very concerned with the presence. And a great part of this exhibition is the literature. And so each binding became, rather than a book binding, it is, particularly with Leonora Sansei, that is her output. The number of pages counted there is exactly what she printed in the books, the 5 books that we know that she wrote or are supposed to have been written by her. They were all published anonymously. So that was a very important part of it to me. Every piece, when you look at the catalog, has a bibliographic reference to drive the story, and so I wasn't dealing so much with issues of corsetry as a medium. Okay, thank you.